Welcome back, everybody. Today, we are going to start the process of wrapping up the course and preparing for the final exam. So first, a few words about where we are in the schedule and what's coming up next week. Next week, we have lecture on Monday and Wednesday. We won't have a lecture on Friday because the last day of classes next week is on Thursday. And starting today and continuing on through Monday and Wednesday of next week, I'm going to start the process of getting us ready to take the final exam. Now, on Monday, I'll be releasing more details about the final exam. I'll be giving more details about the kinds of problems that you'll see on the final exam and how the final exam will be structured. And also for the lab next week, what I would like to do for the lab exercise is to offer an optional lab exercise again next week. And in the lab exercise next week, what I will do is I will give you a problem, which is an actual problem that appeared on an earlier final exam, and basically let you practice writing a solution to the type of problem that you're likely to see on the final exam. And for the lab next week, what we're going to do is we're going to ask everybody to come to their lab time on Tuesday. So instead of having separate Tuesday and Thursday sessions next week, we'll do everybody doing the lab on Tuesday. This will be an optional exercise, basically for practice for the final, and you won't have to turn in anything after the lab exercise on Tuesday. And then on Wednesday of next week, I'll come in and show my solution to the problem that we were working on in the lab exercise. All right, so basically from this point forward, everything that we're doing is aimed at review and preparation for the final exam. And that includes what we're talking about today, because in today's lecture, I'm going to be working through an example. This example problem is an actual exam problem from a previous final exam from this course. So this will begin to give you a sense for the type of problems that I'm likely to give on the final exam. And by working through this example today and working through more examples next week, we hope to give everybody additional practice in solving these types of problems. All right, so let's start with a description of the problem and what we're expected to do, and then we're going to go to work putting together a solution to this problem. All right, so this problem is about trading, and the story behind this problem is that we're imagining that what we're doing is setting up a simple marketplace. Now, in a marketplace, what happens is that sellers and buyers get together and they trade things. Right now, in a full-blown marketplace, we would have lots of things going on. For example, we would have many different things that were being traded in the marketplace. The other thing that we would have to deal with is the fact that when sellers show up, they are expecting a particular price for whatever it is they're selling. And likewise, when buyers come to the market, they have in mind a particular price that they would like to pay for a particular item, right? And managing this sort of scenario can get pretty complicated, especially in scenarios where there are many different items being traded, and especially in situations where sellers and buyers have different ideas about the prices for given items. All right, well, today, to make this problem manageable, we're going to remove a lot of the complexity from this problem by making two very important simplifying assumptions. The first simplifying assumption is that in the market that we're going to be simulating today, there is only one type of thing that's being traded. So we have sellers showing up and we have buyers showing up, and everybody is trading a single commodity that's being traded from one person to another. The other thing that we're going to do to greatly simplify the problem is we're going to remove price from the discussion. Um, we're not going to try to develop an algorithm that tries to match sellers and buyers based on the prices that both of these participants are interested in. Instead, we're going to make this somewhat artificial assumption that the price for whatever we're trading is set and doesn't change. And the only thing that remains to be done is bring sellers and buyers together. All right, so here is what's going to happen in the program that we're going to write. The program is designed to read input from a text file, and in that text file, you'll see information about people who are trying to sell a quantity and people who are trying to buy a quantity. Right? And the text file is in the form of a series of lines. On each line, there are three pieces of information. The first piece of information is an identifying number that is given to every participant in the market. The second item is what this participant is trying to do, whether they are trying to buy or sell. And the third number is the quantity that they're interested in. Right? So for example, the first line here says that market participant 105 would like to buy 250 units of whatever is being traded here. The next line says that participant 333 would like to sell 100 units of whatever is being sold in the market. All right? And our job is to bring together sellers and buyers and produce trades. And specifically, what the program is going to produce as its output is a list of all the trades that take place. Right? So here, for example, we have a seller who's interested in selling 100 units of this item. Right? Well, right before that, we had a buyer show up who was interested in buying 250 units. So obviously what we can do is we can get these two people together and get seller 333 to sell their 100 units to buyer 105. And that will partly satisfy the demand that buyer number 105 has. So we record that trade and we go on basically putting buyers and sellers together, and in each instance where we can get somebody to sell something to somebody else, we make a record of that. And then at the end of the program, we output the record of all the trades that took place as we were able to match buyers and sellers. All right, so that is the big picture of what we're doing. We're going to be writing a program that reads the input file that looks something like the text at the top. And when it runs, it will spit out the output, basically a list of trades that took place in the marketplace. All right, so that is the problem to solve. And let's now begin the process of putting together a solution as a Java program. All right, now what I've done in advance of this discussion is I've already started to write a few small parts of the solution, but most of our time today is going to be spent with me filling in the remaining details and hopefully getting to a complete solution by the end of the time that we have today. Okay, so I've already prepared an input file and added it to the project. So here's a file, orders.txt, that has a list of who wants to buy and who wants to sell. It's a fairly short list. We could certainly add more examples here if we wanted to test this more strenuously, but this is a long enough list of inputs to be interesting and to judge whether or not things are working correctly. Okay, now the next step in the process is if you're dealing with data, very often that data will need to be organized into objects of various sorts. So the next step in the solution process is to identify obvious objects that need to be created. Right now, since in this application we have buyers and sellers, the first obvious pair of objects we need to create are objects that represent those individuals in this simulation. Right, so here is a class that represents a buyer. The only thing that's relevant about a buyer is their ID number and the amount that they would like to buy. Likewise, here is a class for a seller. Sellers are very similar. Each seller has an ID number, and they also have an amount that they would like to trade. And the third obvious object that we can come up with here, because we're going to be generating sales, is we need to have some sort of an object that can represent a sale that is taking place. And again, a sale is basically an interaction that involves two people. It involves the seller and the buyer. So we have ID numbers for those two people. And of course, a sale involves the transfer of a certain amount from one person to another. Right, so that is an object that can represent a sale in our system. Right, and the last basic object that we're going to need is something where we can put the algorithm that is going to assemble all of these trades and figure out what the trades are going to be. Right, and since we need some place to put that algorithm, I have created a fourth class here, which is a market class, and the market is where all of the trades are going to take place and where we're going to figure out exactly who is selling what to whom in this particular scenario. Okay, and I've also started to sketch out the structure of this market class by setting up a few obvious things that we're going to need to have. Right. So first of all, since we're going to have several sellers and several buyers, we need to have some way of creating lists of these things. Right. So that naturally suggests that what we need is one array list, which is a list of all the people who want to sell, and a second array list, which is a list of all the people who want to buy. And we're going to be working with those two lists in the course of our matching algorithm that matches sellers and buyers. And finally, because we're going to be generating a list of sales, we also need a place to store that. So I've added a member variable here, which is a list where we can record all the sales that take place. And at the end of the process, what we're going to be doing is saving all of those sales to a text file at the end of everything that we do. Okay, so now let's dive into the process of constructing an algorithm that can get together the sellers and the buyers and match them and produce a collection of sales. All right, so to do that, what I'm going to do here is, since I've already started the process of creating a class that stores all of the relevant data, to manipulate this data, we're going to be adding a set of methods to this class that one by one will take us through the process of doing everything that needs to be done. Okay, now before we get to the algorithm itself, the next thing to think about is that anytime you're setting up a class and anytime that you are writing a collection of member variables, you automatically need to write a constructor, right? And in this case, since all three of the member variables are array lists, the constructor is the part where we need to go ahead and set up those array lists, right? So here's the code to create and initialize 3 empty array lists. This will be taking place in the constructor, and that does whatever is necessary to get those array lists set up and ready to operate. Okay, now the next thing to do is to sketch out the answer to the question, what methods am I going to need to get all of this work done? Right? And a good way to do that is to follow a practice that I talked about in an earlier lecture, which is so-called top-down design. In top-down design, what you do is you outline the major steps in whatever it is you're trying to achieve. And as you're outlining those steps, you're basically discovering methods that you're going to need to create. So let's begin that process by starting to write some code in the main method. Okay, now, since everything here is going to be run by having a market object, the first obvious step is creating that market object. Right, so let's give ourselves a market object to work with. Okay, now in this process, I can imagine needing to do 3 fairly obvious steps. The first step is opening up the text file and reading the information about all of the buyers and the sellers that we have, all right? And I've sort of have begun that by imagining needing a method like this, a read orders method. So let's go ahead in main and fill in a call to that method. All right, so that's the first obvious step, opening the text file and getting information about all the buyers and the sellers that we have. All right, now the obvious second step is we need to bring those buyers and sellers together, and we need to make a series of trades. All right, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to imagine eventually creating a method in the market class that looks something like this, make trades. And in the make trades method, that is where we're going to bring the buyers and the sellers together and make a collection of trades and store that in the list of sales that we have. Right, and then the obvious third step in this process is, once all of the sales have been created, is we need to save them to an output file. So I'm going to imagine adding a third method to the class that will take the responsibility of saving all of the results out to a text file. Okay, so this is the first major activity in top-down design. You basically identify the major steps that need to be done, and that in turn leads you to anticipate writing certain methods that will carry out those steps. Okay, so now let's go down to the next level in top-down design, where we go through the individual steps in the process and we fill in the details in each one of these individual steps. All right, so starting with the first of the 3 methods, the read orders method, I've already started to sketch out a little bit of the structure that we need here. because we're going to be opening up a file to read data from it. I've put in the usual code that you expect to see whenever you set up a scanner that is reading information from a file. Okay, now also at the end of the process, I put a statement that closes the file when we're done working with it. And in the middle, the obvious thing missing is the code that actually reads the data from the file. Okay, now what we've seen in many examples is that if you're using a scanner to read data from a text file, very often the way that you manage that process is through a while loop. Right? And a classic way to structure this while loop when you are reading data from a scanner is to use a construct like this. Basically say, while the scanner has more data left available for me to read, let's continue reading things from the scanner. Right? And another common pattern that we've seen in many examples is that if you have this sort of loop to read data from a file, the way you should organize it is that each trip through this loop is going to read exactly one row from the input file. Right, so again, let's quickly remind ourselves of what is going to show up on a given row. A given row is going to be a combination of 3 pieces of data. One of these is going to be an integer, the second one is going to be a string, and the third one is going to be an integer. So let's get ready to read an integer, a string, and an integer. All right, so the first integer that we're reading is the ID number of the person who wants to do this trade. All right, so here we would do next int to read that ID number. The second item is the exactly what that person wants to do. And again, we can read a string by doing input.next. And the third item is the quantity that they want to trade. And that also will be in the form of an integer. Okay, so that takes care of reading the 3 things that we know will be on a given line. The next step is to organize these 3 pieces of data into an object and then create that object and finally store that object in the lists that we have. Okay, now the next thing we have to deal with is the fact that we can potentially make one of 2 different types of objects, because the line we just read could be a line for a seller or it could be a line for a buyer. Right? And the way we're going to tell which one of the 2 to do is by setting up an if statement that looks at this what that we just entered. Right? In particular, if the what value equals the string buy, that means that what we're talking about here is somebody who wants to be a buyer. And in that scenario, we're going to need to create a buyer object. Right? And the alternative is that this person is actually a seller, in which case we would need to create a seller object. Right, so let's go ahead and handle the buy case first. All right, so for buying, we need to create a buyer. And anytime you're making a new object, that's done by using the new operation. And in the buyer class, I've already equipped that with a constructor. That constructor takes 2 parameters. One is the ID number of this person, and the second is the quantity or the amount that they would like to trade. All right, so we need to pass those 2 as parameters. So we already have an ID number and we have a quantity. So we're going to pass those 2 things to the constructor to make ourselves a buyer. All right, and then after creating a buyer, we also need to store them. And for that, we have a list of buyers. And we're going to go to the list of buyers and say, add this buyer to the list. Okay, and sellers are going to be very similar. If we're making a seller, we're going to make instead a new seller object. And sellers are created in a similar way. You specify both an ID number and the quantity that they would like to sell, and you've got yourself a seller, right? And then sellers get added to a different list. They get added to the list of sellers. Okay, so that takes care of the standard logic of reading the lines from the file, and for each line that we read, creating an object and storing that object somewhere in our lists. Okay, now as I'm going along here, if you have questions at any point in the process, by all means, feel free to interrupt me and ask your question at any point along here. Okay, now next we have 2 more methods to complete. We have the method that handles the trades, and we also have the method that saves the results out to the output file. Now, just because the third method is probably going to be simpler than the second method, let me go ahead and get the third method out of the way. Let's go ahead and fill in the details of doing the save sales business. because that is likely to be much more straightforward than doing the actual trading. Okay, now, when we are saving the sales information to the output file, we're going to be working with saving data to a file, and for that, we're going to need to create a print writer. Right now, it's at this point that you can either try to remember from memory exactly how you set up a print writer, or, which is probably more convenient, you can go to the course website and see if you can find some example code that shows you how to do this. Let's do that quickly. So we've got lots of examples scattered over many lectures here, but one example that would be immediately relevant is in this lecture here. This is the lecture for working with text files. In this, you're likely to find some examples of how to read things from text files and how to write things. In fact, at the very bottom of this, there is a chunk of code that gives some examples of how you would write using a print writer. So let's go ahead and grab a copy of this because this is going to be useful to us. All right, so copy that and we'll go paste that back over into NetBeans over here. Okay, and the only small change we need to make here is the name of the file that we're working with. In this case, we're assuming that all of our sales information is going to get dumped to a file whose name is sales.txt. Right, and of course we have a fix imports thing here because we're working with a new class. So let's go ahead and fix the imports and take care of that. All right, and finally, one other quick remark while I'm typing out code here. A very common thing especially when you're very quickly typing out code is for the code to get a little bit messy. Well, fortunately for us, it turns out that NetBeans has some really nice tools built in to help you automatically clean up your messy code as you're writing it. And one of those tools is to select a chunk of code and go up to the source menu and simply choose the format command. What that will do is that will automatically restructure the code so it looks much nicer. And nicer code generally is easier to understand, and it's also easier to get right. So that's a helpful thing to do now and then as you are writing your code. Okay, so now we have the print writer set up and ready to go. The next step is to take the data that we want to save and actually save it. Right now, the data that we're saving here is this array list of sales. Right, so let's set up a loop that goes through the array list of sales and saves each one of these out to the output file. Right now, it's at this point I'm going to use a little shortcut. I'm going to use a shortcut to use what's called an enhanced for loop. An enhanced for loop is probably the easiest type of for loop to write once you get used to working with these. And this is by far the simplest and most straightforward way to say something like, let's do something for every object in an array list, right? So that's the simplest way to iterate over all the sales that we have. Now, another thing that we can do here to potentially make our lives much easier is we can sort of pass the buck a little bit and push the responsibility for printing things out to the sale object itself. So what I can imagine doing here is I can imagine adding a method to the sale object that would allow itself to basically write itself out to a print writer. Right now, that method doesn't yet exist. At this point, I'm just imagining having such a method because it would be really handy to have it. So I'm going to basically set this up as an eventual request to write that method, and in a few steps, we'll get around to writing it. Right, so that gets us through the process of writing out all of the sales information in as straightforward a way as possible. And the last thing we need to do here is simply close the print writer, and that would end the writing process. Okay, so in a few minutes, we'll get back around to writing this method. But first, let's finish the job of writing the methods in this class here. Okay, we have one last method to write, and this is the biggest and most important of the methods. This is the method that will actually bring the buyers and the sellers together and create all of the sales that we need to create in this process. Okay, now it's at this point that we need to stop and think a little bit because inevitably in every problem, you're going to reach a point where you need to design something like an algorithm that can solve the problem at hand. Right, so let's imagine a little bit that we were given the problem of bringing a group of buyers and sellers together in a way that we might possibly approach this, right? In fact, to make this concrete, let's suppose that instead of writing a computer program, we were actually doing this in real life. So we had an actual market and we had a bunch of people show up, some people who want to buy and some people who want to sell. Right now, here is a fairly logical way to handle this process of matching the buyers and seller. If I were running this market, the way I would do it is I would say to all the people who are standing around, okay, I know some of you are here to buy and some of you are here to sell. So the first thing I'd like you to do is I'd like you to organize yourselves into two lines. I'd like all of the people who'd like to sell to line up here, and I'd like all the people who would like to buy to line up here. And what I would like these two lines to do is I would like these two lines to approach the table where I'm sitting. And at that table, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the process of bringing the buyers and the sellers together. All right, so once these people are lined up, the obvious thing that I would do is I would go to the front of each of those lines where I would see a seller on one side and a buyer on the other, and I would try to bring these two people together. I basically would ask the seller, okay, how much would you like to sell? And ask the buyer, how much would you like to buy? And let's see if we can get you two folks together and make a trade. Right? And that's the process that we're going to run. We're going to repeatedly bring one buyer and one seller together, have them do a trade. That process is going to continue, and most buyers and sellers, eventually the seller will have sold everything they want to sell, and the buyer will have bought everything they want to buy. And when a given pair of people are both satisfied and they both have done what they came for, we simply say, okay, thank you very much. We've recorded your trades. You can leave now. Right? And that basically removes people from the front of the line, and somebody else steps to the front of the line, and we repeat that process. Right? So it's basically a repeated process where we're constantly bringing sellers and buyers together. And whenever somebody has either sold all of their stuff or bought everything they want to buy, we'll say, thank you very much. We're done with you. You can leave the line and let's go to the next person. Right? And that process logically will continue until we've worked our way through everybody who wants to either sell or buy. Okay, now because this involves a certain amount of repetition, back in the program, this is going to require us to use some sort of a loop. Right? So let's imagine setting up a while loop here. And the purpose of this while loop is to keep trying to match buyers and sellers until we've gone through everybody who wants to do a trade. All right, so let's set up a while loop with some sort of a test here. And then on each round through the while loop, I'll go ahead and type a quick comment of what I'm trying to do here is on each round, what I'm going to try to do is bring together the seller at the front of the seller's line with the buyer at the front at the buyer's line of the line of buyers. Okay, and in a minute, we'll write the logic for actually doing that, bringing those two people together. And as those people come together, they generate trades. And as they generate trades, we're going to be saving those trades to a separate list. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin that process. Let's go ahead and get ourselves a buyer and a seller. All right, so here's a seller. And again, as the comment there says, the way we're going to be getting that seller is by going to the front of the line of sellers. All right, so we simply go to the seller's line. We use the get method to ask for the very first seller in the line of sellers, and that would be get 0. All right, and then we also go to the front of the line of buyers, and we do the same thing there. Okay, and sorry, that should be buyer, not buyers. Okay, now the next thing we need to do, now that we've got just two people that we're talking to, is we need to bring them together and figure out if they can make a trade somehow. Okay, now here's where we have to solve one small problem, and that is very often the quantities that these two people want to work with may be different. So for example, the seller may be interested in selling 200 units of this quantity, and the buyer may only be interested in buying 100 units. Right, so in that scenario, what we can do is we can get the seller to take 100 of the units they want to sell and sell them to the buyer, and at that point, we have completed a trade. Right, and what happens after that trade is that buyer has now bought everything that they want to buy, and they're done. They can leave. We can simply remove them from the list of buyers. Right. Meanwhile, the seller still has 100 units left over that they still want to sell. So we're going to say to them, okay, hang on, stay in the line. We're going to go in the next round. We're going to try to match you with another buyer until you have sold everything you want to sell. Okay, so the first little bit of logic we need to put in here is we need to look at the quantities that both of these traders want to trade and make a decision based on what those quantities are, right? And for that, we're going to need an if statement. All right, so let's begin by asking the seller exactly what quantity they want to sell. Okay, now currently there is not a get quantity method in the seller class. Eventually we'll go in and add that, but let's pretend for the moment that there is a method that we could call whereby we could ask the seller, how much would you like to sell? And what we want to do next is compare that with the same thing for the buyer. How much does the buyer want to buy? Right? And if we discover that the seller wants to sell more than the buyer wants to buy, that particular trade is going to be managed in a particular way. And if it's the other way around, we are going to manage in a slightly different way. Okay, so let's first of all handle the case where the seller wants to sell more than the buyer wants to buy. In that case, the obvious thing to do is to make a sale which represents the quantity that's being traded here. And the obvious quantity that we're going to trade is how much the buyer wants to buy, right? And if you go back and look at the sale class, to make a sale, you need two ID numbers, the ID numbers of the seller and the buyer, and then finally you need that amount. Okay, so now I think we know everything we need to know here because we know, again, it goes in the order of seller then buyer, right? So let's go to the seller and ask them for their ID. There is no get ID method yet. So we'll eventually be adding one. And we do the same thing for the buyer, ask them for their ID number. And then finally, the quantity that's being traded here is clearly given by the quantity that the buyer wants to buy. Right, because that's the smaller of the two quantities, and that is going to limit how much can be traded in this case. All right, and then once we have a sale, the next thing we need to do with it is we need to add it to the list of sales. And then finally, one last thing to do in this case is since we have just met this buyer's need completely, at this point, we can say to the buyer, thank you very much, you're done. You can now leave the list of buyers, all right? And we would do that just by going to the buyer's list and asking it to remove this person because that buyer has now been satisfied and we can safely remove them from the list of buyers. Okay, so that's what happens in that scenario. Okay, now, the second scenario is the scenario in which the seller wants to sell a smaller quantity than the buyer wants to buy. So we can handle that by doing a second case here that looks similar. The only difference is in this case, what limits how much we can trade is how much the seller wants to sell. So in that case, the quantity of the sale would be how much the seller has available to sell. All right, and then instead of removing the first entry from the buyer's list, we would instead remove the seller in this case, because in this case, it's the seller who has completed their trade and they're done and they're ready to go. Okay, so that is the basic mechanics of bringing a single buyer together with a single seller. The next thing we need to fill in is in the structure of the while loop. I didn't get around to actually filling in the test here. And it's at this point we need to think about when should this process keep going, and likewise, when should it stop? All right, well, the obvious answer to that is that this process needs to keep going as long as there are still both sellers and buyers available. And the way we can do that is by just looking at the two lines, all right? So for example, if we ask for the size of a list of sellers and we see that it's greater than 0, and if we also look over to the list of buyers and ask for the size of that list and see that that's also greater than 0, that indicates that there are still sellers and buyers standing around who need to be brought together. So we need to keep going, and that's the obvious test with which to keep the thing running. Right? And that process will finish whenever we either run out of sellers or buyers, and at that point, there's no more trades that can possibly be made. Okay, so that takes care of the hardest part of the logic, which is bringing sellers and buyers together. Right, and again, if you have questions at any point here, feel free to interrupt me and ask a question. Okay, now we're almost done. We have a few things that are underlined because they represent methods that we're trying to call here that haven't yet been written. So let's quickly go and fill those in. So first of all, both buyers and sellers need both get quantity and get ID methods. So let's go ahead and add those quickly. So public int get quantity. Obviously, that is just going to return the amount that is stored in this object. And then also public int get ID. That is simply going to return the ID number that's stored in that object. Right? And that method, those methods look pretty much the same, both for sellers and buyers. So let's go ahead and get a copy of this and also take that over to the buyer class. Okay, so with those things filled in, the NetBeans stops complaining about these methods that it doesn't know about, and the only method left to write is this method right here. This is the method designed to take a sale object and write its details out to a print writer. So let's go ahead and fill in that method, and that should be the last thing that we need. And so that will be public void write to, and again, this is going to take a single parameter, which is a print writer that we're going to be using to write our output out. And then we have to go ahead and fill in the code. So again, we need to fix imports. Let's do that quickly. And then we need to actually write the logic for this. Okay, so here, this is a natural place to handle this because at this point, we have access to all of the information that needs to be printed. So we can go ahead and do a print line statement here that prints everything that we need to print. Okay, and what we need to be printing here is we need to be printing the ID numbers of the two people involved and the amount that they're trading. Right, and that looks like this. Seller ID plus a space plus buyer ID plus a space plus the amount that they're trading. Okay, and that's all that we need to satisfy the need for a write to method. All right, and at this point, NetBeans is no longer complaining. Looks like we've filled in everything that needs to be filled in. And the only thing left to do is to go ahead and run this and confirm that it's doing the right thing. All right, so again, the print writer here that we'll be writing the sales information, it's going to be generating a file named sales.txt. So when we go ahead and run this thing, we should see that file being created and being filled with data. So let's go ahead and run the project. Okay, so it compiled and it's run. Let's go over to the files view and see what we have. Again, we have the original orders.txt here, and here's the new sales.txt. Here's the output that we just generated from this. And the last thing is to compare this against the output that we are expecting to see. Okay, and it's at this point that it looks like I messed up at least one thing. It looks like I actually messed up the output format for the output because the original problem statement says that when we print the information to the file, what we need to be printing is the information more in this format. So let's go ahead and fix that right away. Instead of printing the numbers that we printed here, let's instead print a thing that says this person sells this many units to that person. All right, we'll fix that over here in the sale class. All right, so and again, my memory is very short today, so we need to first put out the seller ID, then we need to say sells. All right, then what we need to do is put the quantity, that's the amount, and we then need to say, what does it say precisely? It says to say that many units to, all right, so we need to put in units to, and then we need to put the ID number of the buyer. Okay, so let's run it again and see that we've got the right format for the outputs now. Okay, so now the sales say this, and again, that more closely matches what the desired output format is. Okay, now the other thing that you'll see here is that these answers disagree. And the obvious question is, why did the answers disagree? Well, one possibility is that we may have been dealing with slightly different inputs. Let's go back and double check the original inputs and make sure that they match what was in the problem statement. All right, so here's the inputs that I had. Here's what was in the problem statement. And again, if you look down the list here, you can see that these match exactly. Okay, so the next question is, why are our sales looking different than the actual results that we are trying to put together here? All right, well, one possible explanation of this is that our algorithm is simply wrong. We simply made a mistake somewhere in our algorithm, and we simply got it wrong. All right, well, one way we can judge that is if you look at both examples, one thing we can do is we can add up the total amount of stuff that was traded. All right, so for example, in the output that I produced, the total amount that we traded, it looks like a total of 750 units were traded. All right, well, if you go over here and you look at the total that was traded, these two together are 500, that's 650. So it looks like these two are off somehow, because in this, I ended up having a total of 750 units traded. In this over here, I had only 650 units traded. Okay, so one of these two is wrong. One of these two is giving the wrong answer. And the next question is, which one of these two is actually incorrect? All right, well, let's go back and let's do this problem by hand. Suppose we just simply had this short list of people who want to trade things. Let's just go through it by hand and see if we can figure out what would happen here. All right, so let's first look at this from the vantage point of the sellers. Okay, if you look at the sellers, there's a total of 700 units that want to be traded here, right? Because this person wants to sell 500, this person wants to sell a total of 100 and another 100. So that's a total of 700 being offered for sale. On the buyer side, we have a total of 650 units that are being offered to buy. All right, and since we have fewer requests to buy than we have requests to sell, the limiting factor here is how many units people want to buy. All right, that's a total of 650. And you notice that this answer here ends up doing 650 things being traded. Whereas this answer over here has a total of 750 things changing hands, right? So clearly there is a mistake here, and most likely the explanation is that this is simply wrong. We made a mistake somewhere in our logic, and something wasn't accounted for here that led to the wrong result. All right, so let's go back and rethink our logic and try to figure out what could possibly explain the trades not working out quite the way that they should. All right, so let me bring back up the logic here for making trades. In fact, let me ask you to take a look at this and see if you can come up with anything that I didn't handle correctly in this logic. All right, and if you can't think of what the problem is, let me focus your attention back on an example that I mentioned as I was writing the code out. The example was, suppose the two people who step to the front of the line are a seller who wants to sell 200 units and a buyer who wants to buy 100. Okay, now what we're doing in that case is we're making a sale between them. We're basically transferring 100 units from the seller to the buyer. Right, and I did actually set up the sale here. It has the quantity that we'd like to trade, and we added that to the list of sales. And at the same time, I said, okay, since the buyer wants to buy 100 units, they're now satisfied. I removed them from the list, which is the right thing to do. Now, what did I miss in that?
Did you not remove the quantity that was sold from the seller's amount? Or
Exactly, right. Because in that case, you've got a seller standing there who wants to sell 200 units. They've just sold 100 units to somebody else. But what we forgot to do is we forgot to change the quantity that they want to sell. That's the missing piece. All right. So what we have to add back in here is whenever anybody sells a certain amount, which isn't the full amount that they have for sale, we need to go ahead and reduce the quantity that they have available. So what that means in this case is I actually need to go to the seller and say to them something like this. Basically, we need to imagine having something like a reduced quantity method. And we would need to tell the seller to reduce the quantity that they have available for sale by the amount that we just transferred to the buyer. All right, so we need to do something like this. Okay, and we need to do a similar thing in the other scenario. The only difference in the other scenario is the other scenario corresponds to a situation where the buyer wants to buy more than the seller has available to sell. So in that case, we would be reducing the quantity that the buyer still wants to buy, all right? And we would be reducing that by the quantity that the seller has just sold them. Okay, so that's what was missing in this, is that whenever somebody makes a partial sale and they sell part of what they have for sale, we need to deduct that from the amount that they have available to sell, all right? So we need to add another method here, public void reduce quantity. Oops. And this will be reduced by a certain amount that is going to be happening in the sale. Okay, and the obvious code for this is what this does is it takes the amount and subtracts away the amount of that sale. All right, and we need a method like this both for sellers and for buyers. So let's get a copy of this and put that over on the buyer side as well. Okay, so let's give this another shot. Now we made that change to the logic. Let's go ahead and run and see what answers we get now. Okay, and if we go back and look at the sales data now, first a quick check of how much got transferred here. It looks like we transferred a total of 650 units, which is exactly what we're looking for. And if you now compare this with the desired output that we're supposed to generate, it looks like they're now identical, and it looks like we've nailed it. Okay, so at this point, we can declare success. We have a fully workable solution. And this is, again, an example of how to go from start all the way through to the end, including fixing errors along the way and identifying problems and diagnosing them and fixing them. These are all activities that you'll need to engage in on exam problems. Okay, so that is the end of today's lecture. When we come back on Monday, we're going to be doing more examples. We're going to be spending all of next week doing examples, including the lab exercise, which will happen on Tuesday. And for the lab exercise, I'll give you another example of an exam type problem and give you the opportunity to work through that sample exam problem. All right, so until then, everybody have a good weekend. And we'll see you all back here again on Monday for more examples.
I actually have a quick question about this example.
Uh-huh.
Would this, the way it's written now, would it still work if the buyer and the seller wanted to like buy and sell the same amount? Because we only have, okay.
Yeah, in fact, that's something that we had skipped over here. In fact, this is something you should actually do in the logic. What you actually need to do here, and this is, it turns out this is another flaw in the program, is you also need to account for the case where the quantities are exactly the same. All right, so really what we should do in that case is we should add another case for that. Let's go ahead and quickly do that. So let's add another case to test for the situation where the quantities are exactly the same. And then finally, the last case that we'll do here is the case where we have what we had a minute ago. That's the logic that we had already. Okay, so in the case where the quantities are exactly the same, we want to do something similar to what we just did here. The only small difference is that in that scenario, if the quantities matched exactly, in that case, we have satisfied both the buyer and the seller. And all we have to do in that case is just remove both of these people from their respective lists. Right? So in that case, we would remove both the front of the list of sellers and the list of buyers. That's how we would handle that particular case. Okay, any other final comments or questions about what we've done? Okay, if not, we'll see you all back here on Monday.
Thank you.